A group of weary construction workers walked into a fancy restaurant, only to be turned away for looking too poor. But when Keanu Reeves saw it happen, he stood up from his table and said 5 words that stopped everyone cold. What happened next left the entire restaurant in stunned silence. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The sun hung low over downtown Los Angeles, casting a warm orange hue across glass towers and bustling streets. Keanu Reeves stepped out of his black motorcycle, removing his helmet as the city's noise faded behind him. He looked tired, but calm, the kind of calm that comes after hours of pretending to be someone else on set. Dressed simply in a black t-shirt, jeans, and worn boots, he looked nothing like the movie star whose name filled headlines. He just wanted one thing tonight, a quiet meal. He pushed open the glass door of an upscale restaurant tucked between 2 luxury boutiques. The air inside was cool and still, filled with soft jazz that seemed to glide across the marble floors. The scent of roasted garlic and truffle butter drifted through the air. Conversations murmured softly among businessmen, art dealers, and couples who spoke in rehearsed tones of elegance. No one noticed Keanu at first. He liked it that way. He took a seat by the window, away from the center of attention. Sunlight caught the edge of his sunglasses as he placed them on the table, revealing eyes that carried years of stories few could ever imagine. A waiter approached, young, polite, and just nervous enough to show he took pride in doing things right. "Good evening, sir. Would you like sparkling or still water?" Keanu smiled faintly, his voice low. "Still's fine, thank you." As the waiter turned to leave, another server leaned close and whispered in his ear. The young man's eyes widened. He turned back, studying Keanu more carefully. Recognition dawned, followed by that familiar mix of awe and disbelief. Within moments, quiet ripples of whispers began spreading through the room. A woman at a corner table nudged her husband, whispering, "Is that him? Is that Keanu Reeves?" Keanu felt the shift instantly. He'd lived with it long enough to know how fame could bend a room's atmosphere. Some people became curious, others suddenly polite, a few insincere. But he didn't flinch. He picked up the menu, scanned it briefly, then set it aside. The waiter returned, his tone suddenly careful, almost reverent. "Would you like to start with a drink, Mr. Reeves?" Keanu nodded, his expression soft. "Just coffee, black." It was always coffee, simple, grounding, something that reminded him of quieter days before all this noise. The restaurant manager, Victor Hale, soon appeared from the back, a man in his late 40s, sharply dressed, with a perfectionist's stride. His eyes landed on Keanu immediately. He approached with a rehearsed smile, extending his hand. "Mr. Reeves, it's an honor. Welcome to La Galleria. Please let me know if there's anything we can do to make your evening more comfortable." Keanu stood briefly, shook his hand, and replied, "I appreciate it. Just looking for a quiet dinner." Victor assured him it would be, but as he walked away, he made a small gesture to the staff, signaling that tonight's service had just turned into a silent performance of perfection. Plates were polished again, napkins were folded straighter. Every glance, every movement, carried the subtle pressure of entertaining someone important. Keanu leaned back, watching it all happen. He didn't ask for the special treatment, but he'd learned to live with the strange choreography of fame. Somewhere inside, though, he missed normalcy, the comfort of being invisible. The irony, he thought, was that the best part of humanity often hides in places where cameras never go. He gazed out the window as the last of the sunset melted into the horizon, unaware that tonight's peace was about to be shattered by something far more revealing than any red carpet moment. The restaurant settled into its rhythm again. Waiters moved in near silence, balancing trays of lamb chops and glasses of wine with mechanical grace. Keanu watched the room quietly, the way people leaned closer when they laughed, the faint hum of whispered deals and practiced compliments. It was a world polished to perfection, and yet something about it always felt hollow to him. He sipped his coffee, the bitterness grounding him in the moment. He'd been filming since sunrise, A long day on set filled with explosions, fake smoke, and endless retakes. The adrenaline had faded hours ago. Now, he wanted nothing more than peace. The candlelight flickered against the glass walls, and for a moment, the noise of the city seemed far away. At the table beside him, two executives in tailored suits discussed a merger over expensive steak. Across the room, a couple took photos of each other's dessert, pretending to be candid. It all felt too neat, too performed. Keanu smiled faintly. The world had changed, he thought. People didn't talk anymore, they curated moments. Victor Hale, the manager, hovered discreetly near the bar, his sharp eyes darting toward Keanu every few seconds. He had run this restaurant for over a decade, and in that time, he'd learned to measure people by their clothes, their watches, their posture. To him, image was everything. And tonight, he saw an opportunity. Having a Hollywood legend dining in his establishment could be a marketing gift. The perfect headline for tomorrow's crowd. Keanu Reeves dines at La Galleria. He whispered to the hostess. Make sure his service is flawless. No mistakes, no delays. The hostess nodded nervously. She was young, new, eager to please. Her name tag read, Lila. She peeked toward Keanu, adjusting her blazer. There was a quiet awe in her eyes, admiration, maybe even respect. She had heard the stories about him helping strangers, taking the subway, buying breakfast for the homeless. In a world obsessed with status, his humility felt like a miracle. Keanu, unaware of their whispers, took another sip of coffee and looked outside. The streets were still alive, people rushing home, delivery drivers honking, city lights blinking like restless stars. Somewhere nearby, a group of construction workers walked past the window, laughing loudly, their reflective vests catching the glow of streetlights. He watched them for a moment longer than he expected. Their laughter was real, raw, and unfiltered, everything this room wasn't. Inside, a waiter refilled his cup with quiet precision. Thank you, Keanu said softly. The young man nodded, grateful just to be acknowledged. There was something disarming about Keanu's simplicity. It made everyone around him slow down, if only for a heartbeat. For a brief while, it seemed as if the evening might pass uneventfully. The hum of conversation returned, the piano in the corner resumed a soft melody, and Keanu opened a small leather notebook from his jacket pocket. Inside were sketches, half-written thoughts, fragments of poems, his way of keeping grounded. He wrote one line before pausing. Peace is found in silence, but silence never lasts. He didn't know how true that would be in just a few minutes. The restaurant lights dimmed slightly as dinner hour reached its calmest point. Soft jazz filled the air, floating gently between clinking glasses and murmured conversation. Keanu closed his notebook, resting it beside his coffee cup. His body relaxed into the chair, but his mind stayed alert, quietly absorbing the small human details around him. The nervous laughter of a first date, the careful posture of a man hiding insecurity behind wealth, the quiet grace of the servers, trying to stay invisible. Victor Hale walked past once more, ensuring every candle burned evenly. His sense of control was almost theatrical. To him, perfection was order. Any disruption was weakness. As he passed Keanu's table, he offered a courteous nod. Everything to your liking, sir? Keanu returned a calm smile. Everything's fine, thank you. Victor exhaled silently, relieved, and continued his inspection. But Keanu's eyes lingered on the man for a moment. There was something rigid in Victor's movements, a kind of armor built from years of catering to the powerful. It reminded Keanu of Hollywood boardrooms, of people mistaking etiquette for empathy. Outside, the city buzzed with life. The workers he'd seen earlier were now turning the corner, heading toward the same building. Keanu didn't notice them reappearing at first. Inside, the staff moved with rhythm and repetition, preparing for the next wave of guests. He glanced again through the window, and there they were, 4 men, their clothes dusty, their boots worn. They looked exhausted but cheerful, carrying that easy camaraderie that only comes from shared labor. They paused outside the restaurant, checking their phones, debating something. One pointed toward the door, laughing. Keanu could read their lips from where he... Saturday. They were joking, teasing the idea of walking into a place like this. He smiled, faintly. He'd been around long enough to know what they were thinking. This place isn't for people like us. He watched as they finally decided to take the chance. They brushed off their shirts, straightened their caps, and stepped toward the door. Keanu leaned back slightly, curious. Lila, the hostess, noticed them too. Her polite expression flickered with hesitation. She glanced at Victor. He was rearranging wine glasses near the bar and didn't look up. She hesitated again, then reached for the reservation book. The door opened, and the workers entered, still laughing quietly, unaware of how they were about to be received. Dust from their boots left faint marks on the floor as they walked in. A few diners turned their heads, wrinkling their noses. The sudden shift in atmosphere was subtle but undeniable. The jazz continued to play, but something invisible cracked beneath it. Keanu's hand paused midair, his coffee cup hovering just short of his lips. His eyes followed the men as they approached the hostess stand. He could already sense it, the tension building like static before a storm. The peace he'd come for was slipping away, replaced by something else entirely. The sound of laughter at the door broke the restaurant's fragile silence. It wasn't the quiet, restrained kind of laughter the regulars were used to hearing. It was real, unfiltered, the kind that came from people who had worked hard and were finally done for the day. 4 construction workers stepped inside, brushing dust from their shirts as the scent of sweat and asphalt mingled faintly with the aroma of steak and wine. They were clearly out of place here, and yet they carried themselves with the easy confidence of men who had earned their rest. Their clothes told their story better than words ever could. Faded jeans streaked with dirt, heavy boots marked by concrete dust, orange and yellow reflective vests still clung to their shoulders, patches of dry paint and grime catching the light. Their faces were sunburned, lined with exhaustion, but their eyes held warmth. One of them, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, was Carlos, the unofficial leader of the group. He was the one who had suggested they come here. "Come on, just this once," he had said back at the site, grinning through the sweat. "My boy just graduated. We're celebrating like real men tonight." His friends, Eddie, Luis, and Ramon, had laughed. They weren't used to fine restaurants, but after 10 hours under the California sun, the thought of sitting down somewhere cool with good food sounded like a dream. So here they were, 4 tired men in dusty boots, stepping into a world that wasn't built for them. The hostess, Leela, straightened up as soon as she saw them. Her professional smile faltered just slightly, not out of cruelty, but out of uncertainty. She looked toward the bar, where Victor Hale was still overseeing his staff. He hadn't noticed yet. "Good evening," she said, trying to sound warm. "Do you have a reservation?" Carlos chuckled, adjusting his baseball cap. "No, ma'am. We just finished work down the street. Thought we'd grab something to eat and celebrate a little. We won't be long." Lila glanced around. Several tables were empty, polished silverware gleaming under the lights. Still, she hesitated. The restaurant's unspoken rule was clear. Image mattered. And these men, hardworking as they were, didn't fit the picture. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I'm afraid we're fully booked this evening." The men exchanged looks. Carlos blinked, surprised. "Fully booked?" He gestured toward the open tables. "You sure about that?" Her cheeks flushed. She stammered, We have some upcoming reservations. I'm sorry." Behind her, a couple of diners were already whispering, their voices like thin blades cutting through the air. One woman murmured something about keeping standards. Another chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. Eddie, the youngest of the crew, rubbed the back of his neck, uncomfortable. "It's fine," he said quickly. "We'll find another place." But Keanu Reeves, seated just a few feet away near the window, had seen everything. His gaze was calm, unblinking. He didn't move. Not yet, but his attention locked on the scene as quietly as a fuse being lit. Carlos gave a polite nod to Lila, trying to hide his disappointment. "No worries," he said, forcing a small smile. "Didn't know you needed a reservation here." He turned to his friends. "Come on, guys, let's go somewhere else." But his tone carried that quiet sting, the kind of hurt a man feels when he realizes he's being judged for the wrong reasons. His friends followed him toward the door, their laughter from moments ago now replaced by silence. Eddie kicked at a tile edge softly, muttering something under his breath. Luis glanced around one last time at the empty tables, shaking his head. Keanu's eyes followed them. He could see the defeat in their posture. These weren't troublemakers or drunks. They were working men, the kind of people who built the hospitals, offices, and apartment towers the city depended on. Their hands carried the marks of labor. Their backs bore the weight of honest effort. Yet here they were, made to feel unworthy of a meal. Just as the workers reached the door, Victor Hale appeared from the bar. He finally noticed them and the uneasy look on Lila's face. "Everything all right?" he asked, his tone clipped but controlled. Lila straightened her shoulders. "They were just leaving," she replied softly. Victor looked the group over his eyes, quick and measuring, taking in every speck of dirt, every crease in their shirts. "Gentlemen," he said with forced courtesy, "I'm afraid we have a dress policy here. We're expecting guests for the evening." Carlos's jaw tightened. "We're guests too," he said quietly. "Or at least we were hoping to be." Victor's smile thinned. "I'm sure you'll find somewhere more comfortable down the block." The words were polite, but they landed like a slap. Ramon muttered, "Guess our money's not good enough here." Victor didn't respond. He simply stepped aside, his hands subtly gesturing toward the exit. The message was clear. Keanu set his cup down slowly. The faint clink of ceramic against the table was almost imperceptible, yet in his chest, something stirred a mix of disbelief and restrained anger. He'd seen arrogance before, but there was something different about this moment. It wasn't loud or overt. It was quiet, casual, and deeply cruel. The men lingered near the doorway for a second, unsure whether to speak up or just leave. Their voices had gone small. Lila looked down at her reservation book, avoiding their eyes. Carlos finally broke the silence. "Sorry to bother you, miss. We didn't mean any trouble." He reached for the door handle, his hand trembling slightly. That small apology, the humility of it, hung in the air like smoke. It was the kind of moment that revealed everything wrong with how the world sometimes works. Keanu leaned forward watching, saying nothing yet, but the spark had been lit. Something in him refused to let this go unnoticed. Carlos pushed open the door, and a gust of warm air rushed in from the street. For a second, the group hesitated, four men frozen between dignity and shame. They weren't angry, they were embarrassed. The laughter that had carried them in was gone, replaced by quiet defeat. To the other diners, it was a minor disruption, something to look at and then forget. But to Keanu, it felt like the air in the room had changed. He watched Carlos glance back over his shoulder once more, his hand still on the door. Their eyes met briefly. There was no recognition, no celebrity awe, just two men, both aware of what had just happened. Keanu saw the silent question in his expression. Why does it have to be this way? Victor, standing behind the hostess stand, adjusted his tie, as if the situation had been successfully handled. He turned to Lila, whispering sharply, "Next time, don't hesitate. We maintain standards here." Lila nodded but said nothing. Her eyes flickered toward Keanu's table, where he still sat unmoving, his coffee now cold. She knew he'd seen everything. The unease in her chest deepened. Across the room, the couple who had mocked earlier whispered again, this time with smug amusement. The woman said under her breath, "Some people just don't know where they belong." The man chuckled, tapping his wine glass. "It's a private establishment. There are rules for a reason." Keanu exhaled slowly. The hum of conversation had resumed, as if nothing meaningful had happened. But to him, it wasn't just a small act of rudeness. It was a symptom of something bigger, a quiet cruelty that people justified in the name of class, decorum, or policy. He'd lived through enough to recognize that kind of arrogance. He knew how it felt to be dismissed, misunderstood, underestimated. The workers were already outside now, standing under the awning. Carlos pulled out his phone, pretending to check directions. though everyone knew he was just buying time to collect himself. "There's a diner 2 blocks down," Eddie said, trying to sound upbeat. "We can eat there." Carlos nodded, but his eyes drifted back toward the restaurant's glass wall. Through it, he could see the people inside laughing, eating, pretending not to notice him. Inside, Keanu pushed his chair back slightly. The faint scrape of wood against marble made Lila glance up. He stood, calm but deliberate, his posture steady. The silence that followed was subtle, yet powerful. A few guests turned their heads. Victor noticed too, his polite smile fading when he realized Keanu Reeves, the guest every eye admired minutes ago, was no longer content to sit quietly. Keanu placed his wallet on the table and said softly to the waiter, "Keep the bill open. I'll be right back." He turned toward the entrance, his steps measured, his expression unreadable. No one in that restaurant could have guessed that what was about to happen next would echo far beyond those marble walls. Keanu had nearly reached the entrance when he heard Carlos speaking again. The workers hadn't fully left yet. They lingered just beyond the glass door, hesitant, as if trying to hold onto a shred of dignity before walking away. Their voices were low but steady. "Miss," Carlos said gently, "we're not trying to cause trouble. We've been working all day just a few blocks away on that new hospital site. We just wanted to sit down for a quick meal before heading home. We'll be quiet, promise." Lila glanced toward Victor again. Her instincts told her to let them stay, but her training told her otherwise. She looked uncomfortable, her fingers tightening around her pen. "I understand, sir," she said softly, "but we have a policy about dress standards. Boots and work clothes aren't allowed in the main dining area." Ramon looked down at his boots, dusty and scarred from years of labor. "So that's it?" he asked quietly. "We don't fit the look?" Before she could respond, Victor stepped forward, taking control. His smile was tight, his tone clipped. "Gentlemen," he said, "I'm sure you've worked very hard today, and we respect that. But we're expecting guests for a private event tonight. We simply don't have space." Keanu stopped just short of the doorway, listening. He didn't need to see Victor's face to know he was lying. There was no private event. The tables inside were half empty, and the quiet rhythm of the restaurant remained unchanged. Carlos exhaled slowly, glancing at his friends. He wasn't a man used to confrontation. He'd faced tougher things, broken machinery, delayed paychecks, years of labor that no one thanked him for. But this was different. This was humiliation, disguised as civility. "We understand," he said finally. His voice was tired, not angry. "Didn't mean to bother anyone." Luis gave a small laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Guess we'll stick to the burger joint," he said. "At least they don't care how we look." They turned toward the door, but before they could leave, a sound came from inside, soft laughter. At a nearby table, 2 businessmen who had been watching the exchange were whispering and chuckling. One of them muttered just loud enough for everyone near the entrance to hear. Probably came to use the bathroom. The other smirked. "Maybe they thought we served beer in buckets here." The group froze for a second. Carlos's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't turn around. Years of swallowing pride had taught him how to keep moving. "Let's go," he said quietly. Keanu's fingers curled around the edge of the doorframe, his jaw tightening. The easy calm that had carried him through the evening vanished, replaced by something harder, something rooted in empathy and quiet outrage. He had seen this look before. The bowed heads, the forced laughter, the slow retreat of men who'd done nothing wrong. And he wasn't going to let it pass this time. Victor watched the men leave with an expression that was meant to look polite, but his relief was unmistakable. He straightened his tie and turned to Lila. "Make sure to sanitize that area," he said quietly. "We can't have dirt tracked around the dining floor." Lila hesitated. "Sir, they weren't being rude. They just wanted dinner." Victor's voice dropped to a sharp whisper. "This is an establishment of standards. People pay for atmosphere here, not discomfort. You'll understand that once you've worked long enough in hospitality." He turned back toward the bar, signaling to a waiter to refill a guest's wine glass. The entire exchange might have vanished like a ripple on still water if Keanu hadn't been standing just a few steps away from his position. He could see the reflection of the men leaving in the glass door. their figures blurred by the city lights, fading into the street like shadows carrying quiet exhaustion. Something about the way Carlos put his arm around Eddie's shoulder hit him hard. They were trying to laugh it off, to make it sound small, but he could feel the sting from where he stood. Keanu's mind drifted back to his early years, before fame, before fortune. Those nights he'd sat in cheap diners between auditions, wearing secondhand clothes, counting coins for a cup of soup. He remembered the looks people gave him then, the way they measured worth by appearance. That memory never left him. He turned toward Lila, who was still standing uncomfortably by the host stand. Her eyes flicked to him and widened slightly. She could tell from his face that he'd heard everything. "Is there anything I can help you with, Mr. Reeves?" she asked, her voice trembling just a little. Keanu shook his head, his tone calm but cold. "Just wondering," he said. "When did respect start needing a dress code?" She didn't know what to say. He glanced at the dining room. Some of the guests had seen the workers leave but were already back to their meals, pretending not to notice. That bothered him more than the laughter. Indifference he'd always thought was the cruelest form of arrogance. Victor approached, smiling again, as if he could smooth the moment over. "Is everything all right, Mr. Reeves? I hope your evening hasn't been disturbed." Keanu looked at him steadily. "It has," he said, simply, "but not by them." The words hung in the air, heavy and clear. A few nearby diners went quiet. Victor blinked, uncertain whether to respond or walk away. He cleared his throat, forcing another smile. "Well, we do our best to maintain our environment. I'm sure you understand." Keanu nodded slightly. "I do," he said softly, "but maybe you've forgotten what that word should really mean." Victor frowned, confused. "What word?" "Environment," Keanu replied. "Because right now, it feels colder in here than it does out there." The room fell into a tense silence. Even the gentle jazz from the corner piano seemed to fade under the weight of his words. Victor's practiced smile wavered. He glanced around, noticing the curious eyes of nearby patrons fixed on him and Keanu. "Mr. Reeves," he began, keeping his tone smooth, "I assure you, we follow policy for everyone. It isn't personal. We simply—" Keanu interrupted him quietly, his calm voice cutting through the air more sharply than a shout ever could. "When someone works 12 hours building a hospital for sick children and can't sit down to eat in peace because of a shirt or a pair of boots, that's personal." Lila's eyes filled with emotion. The words landed harder than Victor wanted to admit. He straightened again, trying to regain control. "With all due respect, sir, this is a fine dining establishment. We can't have construction debris on the seats or oil stains on the carpet. Other customers expect respect," Keanu said, finishing the sentence for him. "They expect respect, and so do those men." The sharpness in his tone carried no anger, only clarity. Victor opened his mouth to reply, but no sound came out. His authority in the room, once absolute, began to crumble under the weight of simple truth. Meanwhile, the workers outside had stopped under the restaurant's awning, unsure if they should leave. The rain had started to fall, soft at first, then heavier. Carlos and his crew stood close to the window, unaware of what was happening inside. Through the glass, Carlos could see Keanu's back, tall and unmoving. He leaned slightly to Eddie. Is that him?" he asked quietly. Eddie squinted. "No way. Why would he care about us?" Inside, Keanu turned toward Lila. "How many tables are open right now?" he asked. She hesitated, glancing toward the reservation list. "At least 6, she admitted softly. "Then don't tell me there's no space," he said gently. "There's always space for crest. Decency." Victor looked down, the line between control and humiliation blurring, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't want a scene, not with one of the most beloved actors in the world standing at his door. "I understand your perspective," he said, lowering his tone. "But we have an image to maintain." Keanu took a slow breath. "Then maybe your image needs to change." The simplicity of the sentence silenced him completely. Keanu's gaze shifted toward the door. where he could see the faint outlines of the men outside through the glass, blurred by raindrops. Carlos was pulling his cap lower, preparing to walk away. Keanu's hand tightened around the back of a nearby chair. His calm expression hardened. He'd seen enough. He'd watched those men build a hospital for children in the same city that now turned its back on them for wearing the wrong shoes. He took a single step toward the entrance, his voice steady and low. "If they can't eat here," he said, "then neither can I." For a moment, the restaurant froze in stunned silence. Every fork, every whispered word, every note of jazz seemed to pause as Keanu's chair scraped softly against the polished marble floor. That small, ordinary sound carried an extraordinary weight. Heads turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even the waiter at the far end of the room, carrying a tray of wine glasses, slowed to a halt. Keanu rose to his full height, his expression calm but resolute. His movements were deliberate, each step steady, unhurried. He wasn't trying to create a scene, but the power in his quiet defiance drew every eye in the room. He walked toward the entrance where Victor and Lila still stood near the hostess podium, the rain outside now glistening against the window panes. Carlos and his friends were just stepping out when Keanu reached them. "Excuse me," he said softly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "Were you being helped?" Carlos turned, startled. He hadn't realized who was speaking to him. No sir. It's fine. We were just leaving. Guess this place is a little too nice for us." Keanu studied him for a moment. The man's face told a story of years of hard work and quiet sacrifice, the kind of life that rarely gets seen. Then Keanu looked past him to Lila. "Can you please get us a table?" Lila froze. She knew she wasn't supposed to disobey Victor, but the authority in Keanu's tone left her uncertain. "Mr. Reeves," she began carefully. Before she could finish, Victor stepped in, smiling his polished, corporate smile. "Mr. Reeves, please, there's been a misunderstanding. We simply have certain standards for our establishment. These gentlemen, well, perhaps the patio would be more suitable." Keanu's gaze didn't waver. "I didn't ask for the patio," he said evenly. "I asked for a table." The weight of the words hit Victor like a challenge. His face tightened. "I'm afraid that won't be possible tonight. As I mentioned earlier, we're hosting a private event shortly." Keanu turned his head slightly, looking around the room. There were empty tables everywhere, gleaming under soft light. "A private event," he repeated quietly. "I see." He faced Victor again, his voice calm but firmer now. "Then cancel my order." Victor blinked. I beg your pardon?" "You heard me," Keanu said. "Cancel my order. If these men can't eat here, I won't either." A wave of murmurs rippled through the dining room. Gasps broke out at nearby tables. The two businessmen who had mocked earlier exchanged startled looks, unsure whether to speak or shrink into their seats. Even the pianist at the corner faltered, his fingers hovering over the keys. Victor's smile faded completely. The authority he'd used so easily minutes ago was gone, stripped away by a simple act of decency that carried more weight than any policy ever could. Victor's composure began to crack. He glanced at the diners, watching in stunned silence. Then back at Keanu, who stood firm beside the workers. "Mr. Reeves," he said, forcing a chuckle. "Surely you understand this isn't personal. We just have to maintain a certain image." "Our guests expect," Keanu interrupted him gently, his tone steady and controlled. "Your guests expect respect. That's all anyone should expect." The words carried through the room like thunder that didn't need to shout. Lila looked down, trying to hide the small smile tugging at her lips. She knew he was right. She'd felt it the moment she told those men to leave. Something in her gut had twisted then, and now it eased, hearing someone finally say what she couldn't. Victor cleared his throat, desperate to regain control. "Please understand, this isn't the kind of establishment for construction attire." Keanu didn't blink. "Construction attire," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "You mean the clothes they wore building that children's hospital 2 blocks away?" The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. Keanu's voice remained soft, but the conviction behind it burned through the still air. These men spent the entire day working so that sick kids will have a better place to heal, he continued. And you're telling me they can't sit down for a meal because their boots aren't polished enough? Lila swallowed hard. A woman at a nearby table lowered her eyes, ashamed. Even the businessmen who had mocked earlier shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The arrogance in their smirks faded, replaced by guilt. Victor's lips parted, but no excuse came out. His face flushed a deep red. "Mr. Reeves, please," he muttered. "There are standards to uphold." "Then maybe your standards need rethinking," Keanu said calmly. "If kindness and dignity don't fit your policy, then maybe it's not a policy worth keeping." The weight of his words settled across the room like a blanket of truth. Every person there felt it. It wasn't anger, it was integrity, raw and unshakable. Carlos and his crew stood frozen near the doorway, unsure how to react. Eddie whispered, "Wait, that's Keanu Reeves." The realization hit them all at once. They had seen him in movies, but this felt nothing like a scene. This was real. Keanu turned toward them, his expression softening. "You've worked hard today," he said. "You deserve a seat and a meal. That's not asking too much." Carlos shook his head, still stunned. "You don't have to do this, sir. We're used to it." Keanu smiled faintly. "Maybe that's the problem." Victor's shoulders tensed. The longer the silence lasted, the more control slipped from his grasp. Across the room, phones began to appear, guests recording, whispering, realizing they were witnessing something far greater than a celebrity moment. They were watching a quiet man defend what truly mattered. Victor's throat tightened as more diners turned in their seats. He could feel the shift happening. Authority slipping through his fingers, replaced by something he couldn't command: respect. His polished image, his carefully rehearsed charm, none of it could match the quiet weight of Keanu Reeves standing for something real. "Mr. Reeves," he said, forcing calm, "you're making a scene. Please, let me..." Keanu took a small step closer, lowering his voice so that it cut through the air with precision. "No," he said simply. "You made the scene when you turned these men away." The words struck like a hammer, wrapped in velvet. Gentle in tone, devastating in meaning. The room went utterly still again. The waiter holding a tray of wine glasses at the back stopped in place, eyes wide. Even the rain outside seemed to hush, as if the world itself was listening. Keanu looked toward the men standing near the door, their boots dripping faintly onto the marble. "Would you join me?" he asked. His tone so natural, so kind, that for a moment they thought he was joking. Carlos blinked. "Sir, you don't have to." "I want to," Keanu interrupted, smiling faintly. "I was just about to eat. Seems to me good company makes the food taste better." The men exchanged uncertain glances, their pride and disbelief wrestling inside them. Luis whispered, "Is this really happening?" Ramon gave a half-nervous laugh. "We don't belong in here, man." Keanu turned slightly, his voice soft but sure. "You belong anywhere decency exists, so sit down." Lila's breath caught. It wasn't the tone of a movie star demanding attention. It was something older, something deeply human. Without waiting for Victor's approval, she stepped forward. "This way, please," she said to the workers. "There's a table right here." Victor's face turned crimson. "Lila," he started, but she didn't look at him. For the first time, she was doing what felt right. Keanu followed as she led the men to a large round table near his own. Every step they took echoed like a small rebellion against arrogance. The diners watched in silence, some embarrassed, others deeply moved. When everyone was seated, Keanu looked at Victor one last time. "You can bring the menus," he said calmly. "For all of us." Victor stood frozen for a second too long, his pride caught between humiliation and fear. Then, with a stiff nod, he turned toward the kitchen. As he walked away, the tension in the room began to unravel. The workers sat awkwardly at first, unsure what to say. Carlos leaned toward Keanu, his voice quiet but full of emotion. "Thank you, sir. You didn't have to do that. Keanu smiled, his tone gentle. That's what makes it worth doing. The soft clink of glasses and the hum of whispered conversation slowly returned, but something fundamental had changed in that room. For the first time all night, it felt human again. Victor returned from the kitchen moments later, his expression tight, his authority visibly slipping. He wasn't used to losing control in his own restaurant. The murmurs from nearby tables made it worse. Every whisper felt like a judgment. He straightened his jacket, forcing his voice into calm professionalism. "Mr. Reeves," he began carefully, "we're happy to accommodate your guests, but perhaps the patio would be a more comfortable setting." Keanu turned his gaze toward him, his tone even but unyielding. "You serve people here," he said, his voice firm but quiet, "or you serve no one." The words hit like a slow-moving wave. Every person in the room seemed to feel them. Even the soft clatter of cutlery stopped. Victor blinked, trying to find footing. "The patio is still part of the restaurant," he said quickly, "and it offers a beautiful view. I'm only trying to make this situation work." Keanu shook his head once. "No, you're trying to make it go away." A long pause followed. The workers looked at each other uncertainly. Eddie whispered, "We can eat outside. It's fine." Carlos nodded reluctantly. "We don't want any trouble." Keanu looked at them, his expression softening. "You've had a long day. You deserve a meal, not a compromise." His voice carried warmth now, threaded with conviction. "You build the places where people heal, where families gather. You shouldn't have to apologize for walking into a restaurant." The room grew heavier, every diner hanging on his words. Somewhere in the back, someone started recording on their phone. Others followed. Lila noticed, her heart racing. She knew what this meant. If the footage spread online, the world would see this moment for what it was, a test of decency. Victor, realizing the eyes and cameras on him, forced another smile. "Mr. Reeves, please," he said, trying to keep his composure. "We can't make exceptions. It would be unfair to the other guests who follow our dress code." Keanu raised an eyebrow slightly. "Unfair?" His voice stayed calm, but the firmness underneath it deepened. "You're turning away men who worked through the heat, who gave their day to build something for others, and you call that fairness?" Victor's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, but every word he could think of sounded wrong. He was standing across from a man whose reputation for compassion was known worldwide. Every second he hesitated. Every twitch of discomfort was being captured by those quietly filming. The workers sat stiffly, uncertain whether to thank Keanu or tell him to stop. Carlos leaned toward him, speaking softly. "Mr. Reeves, you really don't have to do this. We're used to it. We just wanted to grab a meal." Keanu met his eyes. "That's exactly why I can't let it slide." Victor's polished confidence began to crumble. The authority that once commanded the room now felt like a fragile shell. He could feel every guest's gaze burning into him, every phone pointed in his direction. His throat went dry, his thoughts stumbling between pride and panic. "Mr. Reeves," he started again, his voice tight. "You have to understand, it's not about who they are, it's about appearance. People come here for a certain atmosphere." Keanu tilted his head slightly, the faintest trace of disappointment in his eyes. "Atmosphere?" he repeated softly. "You mean the kind where good people are turned away because of dirt on their hands?" Victor hesitated. The question didn't leave him any room to hide. "We just have to uphold an image," he said finally. Keanu took a slow breath, his tone never rising. "An image built on exclusion isn't luxury, it's insecurity." The room seemed to draw tighter around those words. Some diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others nodded silently. A few lowered their phones, sensing this wasn't about a celebrity moment. Anymore, it was about something deeper, something painfully familiar. Lila looked at Keanu, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. She'd spent months working under Victor, forced to smile through small injustices she didn't agree with. For once, someone was saying what she'd been too afraid to. Carlos turned to Keanu, shaking his head. "You're kind, man, but you don't have to fight this battle. We don't want to get anyone in trouble." Keanu smiled faintly, his tone soft but unyielding. This isn't about trouble, it's about what's right. He looked around the room again, his calm gaze sweeping across every table. If we start believing that the clothes we wear determine our worth, then we've already forgotten what humanity is. His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It carried the weight of lived truth. Even those who had come to enjoy their fine meals in silence felt something stir inside them, a quiet shame, a reminder of the times they'd looked away instead of speaking up. Victor could feel the moment slipping away. He turned toward Lila, his tone sharp. "Lila, please escort these gentlemen to the patio. We'll comp their meal for the inconvenience." Lila didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her eyes lowered but her resolve clear. For the first time in months, she found her courage. "They shouldn't have to eat outside," she said quietly. Victor's jaw clenched. "That's not your decision." Keanu stepped slightly forward, standing between them. His voice came low, but the strength in it made Victor flinch. "It's mine." The entire restaurant went silent again. The quiet hum of jazz from the corner piano had stopped completely. Even the air felt charged. Victor swallowed hard. He was facing not just a movie star, but a man who lived what others only preached. Victor's pride was collapsing under the weight of the moment. His instincts screamed to hold his ground, but his confidence had turned into a trembling facade. "Mr. Reeves," he said finally, voice brittle, "if we start bending rules for one guest, others will expect the same. We have policies to maintain consistency." Keanu didn't look away. "Then your consistency has become cruelty." His tone was firm, his expression still calm, but there was steel behind his eyes. "Policies are supposed to protect people, not belittle them." Lila stood quietly nearby, hands clasped, her gaze locked on the floor. The entire restaurant waited, no one daring to interrupt. The workers still sat stiffly, unsure whether to speak or to disappear. Carlos looked between them, the tension unbearable. "Sir," he said to Keanu, "we can leave. Really, you've already done enough. We don't want to cause a scene." Keanu turned to him, his voice soft, almost gentle. "It's already a scene," he said. "Just not the kind you made. The kind they did." That single line hit everyone in the room like a truth they didn't want to face. The murmurs started again quiet, unsure, heavy with guilt. A few diners lowered their heads. A woman whispered to her husband, "He's right." Victor rubbed the back of his neck, his voice faltering. "Mr. Reeves, please, I'm asking you to let us handle this privately. We'll make it up to them later." Keanu's lips pressed into a thin line. "Later never comes," he said softly. "People say they'll do better when it's convenient, but respect doesn't wait for convenience." He turned to Carlos and the others again. "You've worked all day. You're not leaving hungry. Not tonight." The simplicity of his statement silenced everything again. His words weren't grand, but they carried moral weight that no one in that room could ignore. He motioned toward Lila. "Please, bring them menus. They'll sit right here." Lila nodded without hesitation this time. She took the menus and set them gently in front of each worker. The men looked overwhelmed, glancing at one another, their calloused hands hesitating before touching the leather-bound covers. Victor's eyes darted around the room at the diners filming, at Lila defying him, at the workers now seated among polished suits and evening gowns. He suddenly realized that the balance of power had shifted completely. He was no longer the one in control. And then, it hit him exactly who he was speaking to. Keanu Reeves. The man known across the world for his humility, his quiet strength, his humanity. The man whose kindness stories had filled the internet for years. A single headline flashed in Victor's mind. Keanu Reeves stands up for workers after restaurant denies them service. He swallowed hard, his face pale. Any misstep now could destroy everything he'd built. Keanu looked at him one last time and said quietly, "You have a choice, Victor. Do what's right, or keep pretending that policy is worth more than people." Victor's answer came in silence, his pride breaking beneath the truth. For a long moment, no one in the restaurant moved. Victor stood frozen, staring at the group of men seated now among the city's wealthiest diners. The tension was thick enough to touch. Glasses glimmered under the lights. The rain outside had softened to a whisper against the windows. Then, quietly, something shifted. A young waiter near the bar, a slender man with kind eyes, named Liam, stepped forward. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was clear. "I'll take their order," he said. Victor spun toward him, his expression dark. "Liam," he warned under his breath, "that's not your decision." Liam met his gaze, nervous but unflinching. "They're customers, sir. It is my job." A quiet murmur spread through the restaurant. Some people looked away, others watched with growing admiration. Victor's jaw worked in silence before he finally exhaled through his nose. "Fine," he said, forcing the word out. "Do as you wish." Liam nodded and approached the table where the workers sat beside Keanu. His tone softened. "Good evening, gentlemen. What can I get started for you?" The men exchanged awkward glances. They weren't used to menus filled with French terms or dishes that cost more than a full day's wages. Carlos cleared his throat. What would you recommend?" Liam smiled, lowering his voice. "The grilled steak's good. Simple. Comes with potatoes and vegetables. And don't worry about the price, it's handled." Carlos blinked. "Handled?" Keanu smiled from across the table. "Don't argue with the chef," he said lightly. The men laughed nervously, easing into their seats. Victor stood at a distance, seething quietly. But he didn't dare intervene again. He could feel the room watching him. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and no amount of polished authority could restore it now. Keanu leaned forward, his posture relaxed, his tone genuine. "So, you said you've been working nearby?" Carlos nodded, resting his forearms on the table. "Yeah, we're on that new hospital wing project. Been at it since January. Long days, but it's good work." Eddie chimed in, still glancing around like he didn't belong. "It's hard, man. Jobs like this don't come often. Most of us bounce from site to site just trying to keep the bills paid." Keanu listened carefully, eyes steady. "That hospital's going to help a lot of families," he said quietly. "You're doing something that matters." Carlos shrugged, embarrassed by the praise. "We just build it, sir. The doctors are the real heroes." Keanu shook his head. "Heroes come in all kinds. Some heal people, some build the walls that keep them safe." Liam returned to take drink orders, his voice warm and respectful. For the first time since they'd walked in, the workers began to relax. The laughter that had disappeared at the door slowly crept back to life. As the minutes passed, the mood in the restaurant transformed. The tension that had once filled the air began to ease, replaced by a curious kind of quiet admiration. The diners who had been whispering earlier now watched the scene unfold, like witnesses to something rare, something good. Keanu leaned back in his chair, listening more than he spoke. That was his way. He never tried to outshine others. He simply made space for them to exist fully. "Tell me about your families," he said, his tone casual, his smile gentle. "Do they know how hard you work?" Carlos laughed softly, the sound rich but humble. "My wife does. She complains that I bring half the construction site home on my boots. My son, he just graduated. First in the family to go to college." Keanu's expression brightened. "That's incredible, man. You must be proud." Carlos nodded, his eyes glistening slightly. "Yeah, that's why I wanted to come here tonight. A little celebration, you know. Didn't expect it to go like this," Eddie added. "We never come to places like this. We thought it would be fun. Something different." Keanu's tone softened. "And now it will be. Not because of how it started, but because of how it ends." The table laughed lightly, the tension finally breaking. Ramon, the quietest of the group, raised his glass of water and said, "To good people." Keanu lifted his own glass, matching the toast. "To good people." Liam returned with plates a few minutes later, balancing them with professional precision. The scent of seared steak filled the air. He set the plates down one by one, then gave Keanu a small nod. "I'll bring your order out next, sir." Keanu waved him off. "Just bring me whatever they're having. And don't call me sir. I'm Keanu." Liam smiled, a little starstruck, but deeply moved. "Of course." The workers dug in, trying their best to act natural, but there was a kind of disbelief in their faces. They weren't just eating a meal. They were reclaiming dignity that had almost been taken from them. Meanwhile, Victor stood near the bar, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He was still fuming, but there was nothing he could do now. Every second that passed, more diners recorded clips or snapped quiet photos. He knew the moment would spread beyond these walls. It was too late to contain it. Keanu ignored the attention. He didn't raise his voice or play to the cameras. His focus stayed on the men sitting across from him. "How long have you been in construction?" he asked. Carlos wiped his hands and smiled. 27 years. Started when I was 16. My dad was a carpenter before me." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "Then your hands built a part of this city. That's something to be proud of." Carlos chuckled. "Guess I never thought about it that way." Keanu smiled again. Maybe more people should. The restaurant slowly came alive again, but the atmosphere had changed entirely. The quiet hum of conversation returned, softer this time, as if everyone knew they were witnessing something rare. An act of grace that made them reconsider their own hearts. The sound of rain outside, mixed with the faint clinking of glasses, creating a calm rhythm that matched the new peace in the room. Keanu and the workers ate together without pretense. He laughed easily when Eddie cracked a joke about learning to pronounce half the items on the menu. "You and me both," Keanu said with a grin. "I still can't say half of what I order." The laughter around the table spread, genuine and unforced. When the food was gone and Liam returned to clear the plates, he leaned closer to Keanu. "Would you like me to bring the check now, sir?" Keanu shook his head slightly. "No need for that," he said softly. "Put it all on my tab." Liam hesitated. "All of it? Their meals, too?" Keanu's voice was calm and final. "Yes, everything." He glanced at the men, who immediately began protesting. "Wait, no way," Carlos said, sitting up straight. "You already did enough, Mr. Reeves. We can pay for our food." Keanu smiled, his expression gentle. "Then let's call it something else," he said. "Not charity, not a favor, just lunch with friends." That simple phrase lingered in the air, warm and effortless. Eddie and Luis exchanged glances before nodding slowly. Ramon smiled. Then, "Thank you, friend." Keanu raised his glass again, toasting quietly. To a good meal and better company. Around them, the diners who had once stared with judgment now clapped softly, a few even smiling. It wasn't a loud or forced applause, it was genuine. The kind that comes when people see something beautiful they can't quite describe. Liam cleared his throat, trying to steady the emotion in his voice. "It was an honor serving you all tonight," he said sincerely. Keanu looked at him with appreciation. "No, Liam, the honor was yours to claim. You did the right thing when no one else would. Don't ever lose that." The young waiter nodded, eyes glistening, then walked back to the kitchen, head held a little higher. At that moment, Victor stepped forward, unsure what to say. The arrogance that had defined his posture all evening was gone. He opened his mouth but couldn't find words. Keanu glanced at him once, not with anger, but with quiet disappointment, the kind that makes a man rethink his reflection. Victor lowered his head slightly, ashamed. As Keanu and the workers stood to leave, a murmur followed them, not of gossip this time, but of admiration. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city lights shimmered against the wet pavement as they stepped into the night together, laughter echoing softly down the street. Inside, one phrase remained in every whisper: just lunch with friends. By the time Keanu and the construction workers stepped out into the cool Los Angeles night, the moment inside the restaurant was already being immortalized. At a corner table near the back, a young woman named Samantha had quietly recorded everything on her phone. She hadn't meant to intrude at first. She only wanted to capture the unbelievable sight of Keanu Reeves standing up to a restaurant manager. But as the scene unfolded, she realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. She posted the clip to social media that same evening with a simple caption: "Keanu Reeves stood up for a group of construction workers who were refused service tonight. The world needs more people like him." Within minutes, the video began to spread. First, it gained a few dozen likes, then hundreds, then thousands. By the time Keanu arrived home and turned off his phone for the night, it had already passed 1 million views. The footage was clear and powerful. Keanu's calm voice saying, "You serve people here, or you serve no one." And the quiet applause that followed. The internet reacted instantly. Hashtags began to trend across platforms. Number True Brother, number Keanu for Justice, number Dignity Matters. Comments poured in from around the world. One read, "He didn't just pay for their meal, he paid back a debt humanity owed to kindness." Another said, "This is why he's the only celebrity I'll ever trust." By morning, the video had crossed 10 million views. News outlets picked it up. Headlines filled the web. Keanu Reeves defends construction crew after restaurant denies them service. A lesson in class from Hollywood's most humble star. Keanu's kindness strikes again. The restaurant's name, unfortunately for Victor, was clearly visible in the video. Review sites were flooded overnight, with comments condemning discrimination. Some people swore they would never eat there again. Others demanded an apology. Meanwhile, the workers woke up to a world that suddenly knew their faces. Carlos's phone buzzed endlessly that morning. His son ran into the kitchen waving a tablet. "Dad, you're on the news," he shouted. Carlos blinked at the screen. There he was, sitting beside Keanu Reeves, looking stunned and awkward as millions of people watched. Eddie couldn't believe it either. His co-workers at the construction site cheered and teased him when he arrived that morning. "Hollywood Eddie," they laughed. "Don't forget us when you're famous." But behind all the jokes was pride. They'd been seen, not pitied, not dismissed, but seen. Through it all, Keanu stayed silent. He didn't post, didn't comment, didn't reply to reporters who began calling his publicist. To him, it wasn't news. It was simply what any decent person should have done. By mid-morning, the story had reached every corner of the internet. Entertainment sites published timelines of the incident, dissecting every frame of the video. Commentators praised Keanu's composure, contrasting it with Victor's stiff arrogance. Social media feeds overflowed with clips, memes, and heartfelt posts. Some showed Keanu's quote over soft piano music, "If they can't eat here, I won't either." Others edited the footage into short montages titled, "A Masterclass in Humanity." Within hours, reporters camped outside the restaurant's entrance. News vans lined the street, and microphones waited for any statement. Victor tried to stay hidden in his office, his phone buzzing non-stop with calls from the restaurant's owner. The official statement they released was carefully worded. La Galleria has always prided itself on hospitality and inclusion. We regret any misunderstanding that occurred. But the internet wasn't fooled. The comments poured in under every post. Misunderstanding? We saw the video. Others mocked the apology's formality. It's not a misunderstanding when you make hardworking people feel small. Meanwhile, Keanu's team began receiving requests from talk shows, late-night hosts, and global networks. Everyone wanted to hear his side. One reporter even caught him outside his home, asking, "Mr. Reeves, what do you have to say about the viral video?" Keanu smiled politely, but said nothing. He simply held up his hand, nodded once, and continued walking toward his motorcycle. When asked later why he didn't respond, his assistant explained in a brief email, "Mr. Reeves doesn't believe kindness needs a press release." That single sentence became as famous as the video itself. Back on the construction site, Carlos and his crew couldn't stop shaking their heads at the absurdity of it all. "We were just trying to grab dinner," Ramon said, laughing. "Now people are calling us heroes." Carlos smiled modestly. "No, they're calling him the hero. We were just in the right place when he decided to remind the world how to act." But in truth, their lives began to change too. A local radio station invited them to share their side of the story. Carlos was nervous, speaking into the microphone as the host asked, "What went through your mind when Keanu Reeves stood up for you?" He paused before answering. "It wasn't just about us," he said slowly. "He stood up for every working person who's ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. He made us feel like we mattered again." The host grew quiet for a moment, then said softly, That might be the most powerful thing anyone's said about him yet. Outside the studio, reporters waited for sound bites, but Carlos didn't play into the attention. He just smiled shyly and said, "We were lucky to meet a good man, that's all." By evening, the story had reached television screens across America. Major news anchors spoke with the same awe and warmth usually reserved for acts of heroism. One segment opened with the headline, "Keanu Reeves reminds the world what class really means." Another reporter standing outside La Galleria told viewers, "It wasn't anger or celebrity power that changed the room, it was calm integrity." Clips of Keanu helping the workers find a table, laughing with them, and saying "just lunch with friends" played on repeat. Talk show hosts discussed it with admiration. One said, "This wasn't a publicity stunt. This was a man living his values." Another added, "He didn't call attention to himself. He redirected it toward kindness." The internet flooded with reaction videos. Former service workers shared stories of discrimination. Construction crews across the country posted photos of themselves eating lunch together under the hashtags #TrueBrother and #DignityMatters. Teachers discussed the story with their students as an example of respect in action. A high school ethics teacher in Chicago even turned it into a classroom lesson titled "Character in Silence." By now, the restaurant's rating online had plummeted. Victor avoided cameras entirely. Inside, staff whispered that he might resign. Lila, on the other hand, was quietly celebrated online after someone recognized her from the footage. People praised her courage for eventually standing with Keanu. She received messages from strangers saying she inspired them to do what's right, even when afraid. Meanwhile, Keanu remained unreachable. He had no statement, no press appearance, no interview. When fans gathered outside his home holding thank you signs, he waved, smiled, and rode off on his motorcycle. To him, the story wasn't about heroism. It was about decency. In one brief interview days later, his assistant was asked if Keanu would ever address the viral event. She smiled and said simply, "He'd rather people focus on the message, not the man." That line became another viral quote, printed on posters and shirts that read, "Focus on the message, not the man." As for the construction crew, their story continued to ripple outward. They were invited to a community banquet hosted by a local union, where hundreds of workers stood to applaud them. Reporters tried to get dramatic quotes, but Carlos kept his humility. "Keanu didn't do it to make noise," he said softly. "He did it because he saw people being treated unfairly." That's it. The crowd clapped until the room filled with warmth and laughter. Carlos's son recorded part of his father's speech, uploading it online later that night. It quickly gathered millions of views again. Captioned simply, "He taught us that being famous doesn't make you important. Being kind does." In the days that followed, as the headlines began to fade, the impact remained. People across the world remembered the moment not for its drama, but for its heart. A quiet act of justice carried out without a single shout, just calm strength and truth. The following week was chaos at La Galleria. The restaurant that once prided itself on exclusivity now stood under a storm of criticism. Online reviews poured in by the hundreds. Some were furious, others heartbroken. "I used to dine here every Friday," one review read. "Now I can't even look at this place without thinking of those men being humiliated." Another said, "If your brand is about dignity, start by showing some." Victor Hale sat in his office, pale and exhausted. The blinds were half closed, his desk covered in printouts of headlines and internal memos from the restaurant's investors. Every news outlet had replayed the viral video on repeat. Every social media platform buzzed with condemnation. His phone buzzed again, another message from the restaurant's owner, Margaret Langford, demanding answers. When she finally arrived that afternoon, the atmosphere turned heavier. Margaret was a sharp woman in her 60s, elegant and composed, but her patience had evaporated. She stormed into Victor's office, slamming the door behind her. "Do you realize what you've done?" she said sharply. Victor stood up, his voice trembling. "Margaret, please. It was a misunderstanding. We have a policy. I was trying to protect the brand's image." She threw a printed review onto his desk. Protect the image? You destroyed it. The brand used to mean sophistication. Now it means arrogance. He tried again, his tone defensive. That video was taken out of context. The internet twists everything. Mr. Reeves blew the whole thing out of proportion. Margaret stared at him, incredulous. Keanu Reeves is being praised around the world for showing compassion, and you're blaming him? Victor, people didn't turn on us because of him. They turned on us because you forgot what service means. Victor's shoulders slumped. I was doing my job. She shook her head. Your job was to make people feel welcome. Instead, you made a fool of this establishment. Investors are calling for your resignation. They're threatening to pull funding from our new branch project. He stepped closer, desperate now. Margaret, please, don't fire me. We can recover from this. I'll issue a statement. She cut him off sharply. No, Victor, you won't. This restaurant needs a clean slate, and that begins with you stepping down. Her words hung in the air like a final verdict. Victor's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Margaret gathered her coat and said quietly, We've already drafted the public apology. I suggest you read it before it's released. That evening, La Galleria's official social media page posted a statement. We extend our deepest apologies to the individuals involved in the recent incident at our establishment. What occurred does not reflect our values. The staff member responsible is no longer employed with us. The post went viral within minutes. Some praised the move. Others called it too little, too late. For Victor, it was the end of a long, polished career, one undone not by a scandal of deceit or theft, but by a single moment of pride. As the news of Victor's dismissal spread, the restaurant staff moved through the next few days in a haze. The elegant chandeliers still glowed. The tables were still set with silver and glass, but something in the air had changed. Gone was the quiet arrogance that once defined La Galleria. In its place was humility, a quiet recognition that reputation meant nothing without respect. Lila arrived early one morning to find reporters waiting outside. They weren't there to ask about food. They wanted to know what it was like to work under Victor, and whether she agreed with Keanu Reeves's actions. She said little, only this. He reminded us what hospitality really means. Her answer spread almost as quickly as the video itself. Inside, employees whispered about Liam, the young waiter who had stepped forward when no one else would. The staff treated him differently now. He wasn't just the quiet kid from the night shift anymore. He was the one who stood up for what was right. Some of the newer servers even called him the heart of La Galleria. Liam didn't see himself that way. He was just doing what he thought was right. But the world had noticed him too. A local newspaper ran a follow-up story titled "The Waiter Who Defied the Rules." It described how a young man with no authority had changed the course of a scandal simply by acting on instinct. His phone filled with messages from strangers thanking him for having courage. But one envelope stood out. It arrived quietly 3 days later, delivered by hand, addressed in neat handwriting. There was no return address, just 2 initials on the back. K.R. Liam opened it slowly. Inside was a short, handwritten note on cream-colored paper. You chose what's right over what's safe. That's real courage. K.R. He read it twice before setting it down. There was no signature flourish, no publicity tone, just the truth. He smiled, his hands trembling slightly as he folded the letter again. That night, he placed it in a small frame and set it on his kitchen counter. Every time he passed by, he looked at it not out of pride, but as a reminder that integrity doesn't need applause. Meanwhile, Keanu remained silent. He gave no interviews, refused every invitation to speak about the event. He didn't need to. The story had already told itself. What mattered to him was that the right thing had been done, and that someone like Liam existed to carry that truth forward. At La Galleria, the weeks that followed brought sweeping change. Margaret ordered new staff training programs focused on empathy and equality. The restaurant even launched a charity initiative to provide meals for local workers once a month, quietly calling it the Table for All program. For every patron who sat beneath those chandeliers now, the story lingered of one night when silence was broken, when humility stood taller than power, and when a quiet man in a black t-shirt reminded everyone that dignity has no dress code. The next morning, the construction site buzzed with energy before sunrise. The sound of power tools and clanking metal echoed through the air, but something about the atmosphere was different. The men who had worked beside Carlos, Eddie, Ramon, and Luis all knew. Word had spread fast, faster than concrete could dry. When Carlos arrived, coffee in hand and hard hat under his arm, a chorus of teasing shouts met him from across the yard. "Hey, Hollywood!" one of his crew members yelled. "You taking autographs today? Or are we too underdressed?" Another laughed, waving a phone in the air. "You see this? You and Keanu got more views than my kid's TikTok for a whole year." Carlos chuckled, shaking his head. "I can't even believe it," he said. "We were just trying to get some food." Eddie grinned as he walked past with a wheelbarrow. "Yeah, and we ended up dining with John Wick himself. My wife still doesn't believe it. She thinks I'm pranking her." Ramon joined in, tapping his lunchbox. "Man, my mom called me last night crying. Said she's never been prouder that I work construction. Said it took a movie star to make the world see us for who we are." The laughter softened for a moment. Everyone knew what he meant. For years, they had been invisible faces hidden behind hard hats and dust, doing work that built cities but rarely earned respect. Yet now, one man's small act of decency had made the world look again. Carlos climbed the steel stairs to the upper level of the site and paused, watching the sun rise over Los Angeles. He could still picture that restaurant, the shine of the marble floors, the stiffness of the people who had looked at them like they didn't belong. But what stayed with him most wasn't the embarrassment. It was the moment Keanu stood up. He could still hear his voice, calm but certain. "You serve people here, or you serve no one." Those words kept echoing in his head, like a quiet reminder that kindness still existed. Later that morning, as Carlos checked measurements on a support beam, his phone buzzed. It was his son, Mateo, calling from school. "Dad, everyone's talking about you," he said breathlessly. "You're on YouTube with Keanu Reeves," my teacher showed the class. They couldn't believe it. Carlos laughed. "Guess your old man finally made the news, huh?" Mateo's tone softened. "No, Dad. They said you're a good man. I already knew that. But now everyone else does too." Carlos went silent for a second, swallowing the emotion rising in his chest. He smiled, eyes glistening beneath his hard hat. "Thanks, kiddo. That means more than you know." By noon, the crew gathered for their lunch break near the scaffolding. The site was dusty, loud, and alive. But in the middle of all that noise, Carlos and his team became the center of attention. Some workers showed him the video again on their phones, laughing as they replayed the moment Keanu said, "You serve people here, or you serve no one." "Look at your face, man," one worker teased. "You look like you just saw God walk in." Carlos laughed hard, shaking his head. "I did feel like that for a second. Thought the manager was going to throw us out, and then Keanu Reeves shows up out of nowhere like a guardian angel in a black t-shirt." Luis grinned between bites of his sandwich. "My wife said she cried watching that clip. She said it reminded her that good people still exist in this world, and that maybe, just maybe, there's still decency and fame." Eddie nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, you know what got me? He didn't care that people were filming, didn't care about attention. He just wanted to make things right." Carlos agreed. "That's what hit me too. He didn't make a speech. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, calm and real." They sat quietly for a while, the sound of drills echoing in the distance. Then Ramon said softly, "Ever think about what would have happened if he wasn't there?" Carlos sighed. "We'd have walked away, gone to that diner down the street, maybe laughed it off, maybe not. But it would have been just another night when someone made us feel small." He looked down at his hands, calloused, strong, covered in the kind of grit that didn't wash off easily. "I've had those nights before. We all have. But this time, it ended different." As they talked, other workers joined their circle, curious and moved. Some were younger, still new to the trade. One of them asked quietly, "Do you really think people will treat us differently now?" Carlos took a long breath. "Maybe not everyone, but someone will. Maybe the next time a guy like us walks into a restaurant, the person behind the counter will think twice, and that's enough for me." The group fell into a reflective silence. The wind rustled through the unfinished beams. There was something sacred in that stillness, something proud. When the whistle blew to signal the end of break, Carlos checked his watch, then looked around at his crew.
"All right, back to it. We've got a hospital to finish."
Eddie grinned. "And hey, if Keanu ever stops by the site, first round of coffee's on me." Everyone laughed, their spirits lighter than they'd been in months. That evening, when the workday ended, Carlos drove home through the city lights. His phone kept buzzing friends, relatives, even an old coworker he hadn't heard from in years. Everyone wanted to talk about the video, but what meant the most was waiting at home. As soon as he stepped into the house, his wife, Elena, came out of the kitchen smiling. "The celebrity's home," she teased, wiping her hands on a towel. Carlos chuckled and hugged her. "If I'm a celebrity, I still have to fix that leaking sink, right?" She laughed softly. "Always." Then she looked at him more seriously. "I'm proud of you, Carlos. You didn't let them shame you, and you taught our son something important." Carlos glanced toward the living room where Mateo was watching TV. The screen was paused on a news segment showing Keanu's photo beside a headline that read, "A stand for dignity." He swallowed hard. "I didn't teach him, Elena," he said quietly. "Keanu did. I just lived it." Several weeks passed since the incident at La Galleria. The viral storm had faded from headlines, replaced by newer scandals and fleeting stories. But for Victor Hale, the echo of that night never left him. The silence in his apartment was heavier than any public backlash. Each morning, he woke to the same patterned coffee, a glance at unopened mail, and an uneasy quiet filled with thoughts he couldn't escape. He had worked in hospitality for over 20 years, priding himself on control and perfection. Yet now, stripped of his title, he finally saw the hollowness behind that perfection. For the first time in decades, he wasn't managing anyone, wasn't rehearsing smiles or inspecting glassware. He was left with only his reflection, and it stared back with disappointment. Everywhere he went, reminders of that night appeared. The video played on news screens, at the gym, the grocery store, even in small cafes. People didn't recognize him immediately, but when they did, the polite smiles turned cold. He'd become a symbol of what arrogance looked like under pressure. At first, he tried to justify it. He told himself he was protecting the restaurant's standards. He told friends it had all been misunderstood. But as the days went on, the excuses felt thinner and emptier. What haunted him most wasn't Keanu's calm defiance. It was his grace. There had been no anger, no insult, just truth. And Victor had no defense against it. One evening, walking through downtown Los Angeles, he passed by a small diner, one that looked nothing like the places he used to manage. The walls were chipped, the tables mismatched, but the laughter inside was genuine. Through the window, he saw a waitress helping an older man in a wheelchair, smiling as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Something about the scene stopped him cold. He realized that, for years, he had mistaken polish for worth, image for value. All those years enforcing rules about who belonged where had made him blind to what hospitality truly meant. That night, he made a decision. He found a small shelter across town that offered meals to the homeless and families in need. The first day he volunteered, the director asked him why he wanted to help. Victor didn't have an eloquent answer. "Because I forgot what kindness looked like," he said quietly. He began showing up every morning, washing dishes, serving plates, greeting people by name. There were no suits, no investors, no ratings to protect. For the first time, he felt useful in a way that didn't depend on approval. Over the following weeks, Victor settled into a rhythm that felt entirely foreign to his old life, but strangely right. The shelter was located in East Hollywood, a small brick building with fading paint and a crooked sign that read, "Hope Haven Community Kitchen." Every morning he arrived before sunrise, tying an apron around his waist and rolling up his sleeves. The air smelled of fresh bread and coffee, the kind that came from old tin cans, not imported beans. It was nothing like the luxury establishments he used to oversee, but it was alive in a way he'd never felt before. The first few days, some volunteers recognized him from the viral video. There were whispers, a few curious looks, but no one said anything cruel. Instead, they watched him quietly, waiting to see if he would stay. Most didn't, but Victor did. Day after day, he kept coming back. He started by cleaning tables and sorting produce deliveries. Soon, he was teaching new volunteers how to organize service lines efficiently. His old management skills returned, but this time, they served a different purpose. He wasn't ordering people around anymore. He was helping them create order for the sake of others. One afternoon, a young man named Javier joined the shelter program. He was 19, recently laid off from a dishwashing job, and living in his car. Victor noticed how nervous he was during the first shift. He dropped a stack of plates, flinching as they shattered. Instead of scolding him, Victor helped him sweep the shards. "Don't worry about it," he said gently. "You're here to learn, not to be perfect." The kindness in his own voice surprised him. Months earlier, he would have reprimanded someone for a mistake that small. Now he found himself remembering Keanu's words. Policies are supposed to protect people, not belittle them. As weeks turned into months, Victor became a mentor to the younger volunteers. He taught them not just how to serve food, but how to serve with dignity, looking people in the eyes, asking for their names, treating each person as more than a statistic. It wasn't redemption through speeches or apologies. It was redemption through repetition, through showing up, doing good, and letting time rebuild what pride had destroyed. One evening after closing, as he wiped down a counter, Javier handed him a folded piece of paper. "They're doing a story about the shelter," the young man said. "They want to include you. The director said your transformation might inspire others." Victor smiled faintly. "No, thank you," he said. "Let's let the food do the inspiring." But later that night, after everyone had gone, he sat in the dark, with that idea lingering. He felt grateful. The person he'd been, the man obsessed with image, felt like a ghost he'd finally outgrown. That weekend, he sat at his small kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and a pen. A blank sheet of paper lay in front of him. For a long time, he stared at it, unsure where to begin. Finally, he wrote 2 words at the top: "To Mr. Reeves." The letter took him all night to finish. He poured everything into it: the guilt, the realization, the slow rediscovery of humanity. He read the final lines out loud. "You showed me what leadership looks like when it's rooted in humility. I thought I was teaching people about service. That night, I realized I'd forgotten how to serve at all. I can't undo my mistakes, but I can build something better from them." He signed his name, sealed the envelope, and placed it by the door. It was the first time in years that Victor Hale felt peace. Months after the night that changed his life, Liam still remembered every detail. The soft tremble in his hands when he'd stepped forward. The way Keanu looked at him, not as a subordinate, not as a server, but as an equal. That one moment had redefined what courage meant for him. After Victor's firing and the restaurant's new management, La Galleria had changed for the better. Margaret Langford had personally thanked Liam for what she called the quiet act that saved the soul of this place. She offered him a promotion to floor supervisor, a rare honor for someone his age. But even as he accepted, something inside him stirred. The promotion felt good, but it wasn't the destination. It was a beginning. Every night after closing, Liam found himself thinking about what Keanu had done, not just for the workers, but for him. Standing up for others wasn't about power or position. It was about heart. And Liam began to feel that maybe his heart was calling him somewhere else. He started saving money, quietly setting aside a portion of each paycheck. He worked extra hours, learned the business side of restaurant management, and even took evening courses on small business planning. Whenever doubt crept in, he'd look at the framed letter from Keanu that still sat on his kitchen counter. "You chose what's right over what's safe." That's real courage. It took nearly a year before his idea became real. With the help of a small business grant and a friend from culinary school, Liam opened a modest cafe in East Los Angeles. He called it the Second Chance Cafe. The space was small, a corner shop with exposed brick, hand-painted murals, and sunlight pouring through wide front windows. The coffee was strong, the pastries were simple, and the message was clear: everyone deserves a new beginning. Liam made it his mission to hire people who struggled to find work elsewhere: veterans, ex-convicts, single parents, and young people aging out of foster care. He believed that giving them a place to belong could change everything. His first hire was a veteran named Caleb, a soft-spoken man who had battled depression since returning from overseas. Liam taught him how to roast beans, how to greet customers, how to believe in himself again. The second was Tanya, a young mother who had just been released from a correctional program. She was nervous at first, certain no one would trust her around money or customers. But Liam gave her keys to the register on her third week. "Trust works both ways," he told her. Word spread quickly about the little cafe with the big heart. Customers came not just for the food, but for the feeling, the warmth that lingered in every smile and cup. The walls were covered with photos of the staff and their stories, labeled simply, "People who decided to start again." And every morning when Liam unlocked the doors, he'd take a deep breath and whisper to himself, "Serve from the heart." Business grew slowly at first, but what made the Second Chance Cafe special wasn't the money, it was the people. Regular customers began to notice that something about the place felt different. The laughter was genuine, the service was personal, and the air carried an unspoken message: kindness lived here. One morning, an older man who came by every week leaned over the counter and said to Liam, "You can taste the soul in this coffee." Liam smiled, wiping his hands on his apron. "That's all we're trying to do, serve a little bit of heart with every cup." Behind him, Caleb was whistling as he polished the espresso machine. Tanya chatted with a mother and her little girl, who were picking out muffins. In that moment, Liam realized that his cafe had become something he never imagined: a family built not by blood, but by second chances. Then, one quiet Tuesday morning, a familiar figure walked through the door. Liam didn't recognize him at first. The man wore a simple gray hoodie, jeans, and a calls baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. But when he looked up, smiling politely as he ordered, Liam froze. "Just a black coffee, please," the man said softly. Liam's heart skipped. The voice was unmistakable. It was Keanu Reeves. For a moment, Liam couldn't speak. He quickly prepared the order, hands steadying as muscle memory took over. He placed the steaming cup on the counter and said, "It's on the house." Keanu looked at him, the same calm, kind eyes as before. "Then let's make it even," he said, setting a few bills under the cup before walking to a small corner table by the window. Liam tried not to stare, but every few seconds, his eyes drifted over. Keanu sat quietly, sipping his coffee, looking around at the decor, the laughter, the community that filled the space. There was no entourage, no fanfare, just a man enjoying a peaceful morning in the kind of place that reminded him why he'd stood up that night. When he finished, Keanu stood, tucked his chair in, and gave Liam a nod before heading toward the door. Liam hurried to clear the table, and that's when he saw it. Underneath the coffee cup was a folded note and a neatly stacked pile of cash. His breath caught as he unfolded the paper. "Keep serving from the heart. K.R." Below it was a stack of crisp bills, $10,000 exactly. Liam stood frozen, the cafe spinning around him. Tanya noticed and asked softly, "What's wrong?" Liam handed her the note with trembling hands. As she read it, tears welled in her eyes. Caleb came over next, eyes wide as he saw the cash. 10,000. For what? Liam smiled through the emotion rising in his throat. "For all of us," he said quietly. "For what we're trying to do." He placed the note in a small frame and hung it near the counter beside the register where everyone could see it. Underneath, he wrote a small plaque that read, "The gift of kindness keeps going." That day, customers who walked in could sense something different in the air. The laughter was brighter, the smiles warmer. And when Liam looked out the window, he saw Keanu walking down the sidewalk, his figure fading into the crowd, quiet, humble, unchanged. By the time Liam's cafe became a local success story, the ripple of what Keanu had done months earlier was still alive in the media. People hadn't forgotten. Every few weeks, the viral clip resurfaced on social media with captions like, "The day Keanu Reeves taught the world humility," or "Kindness is power." It wasn't just a trending moment anymore, it had become a quiet cultural reference, a reminder of how one act of decency could change countless lives. Talk shows began revisiting the story, using it as a symbol of integrity in an era obsessed with fame and wealth. One popular late-night host played the video again for his audience, pausing at the exact moment Keanu said, "If they can't eat here, I won't either." The crowd erupted in applause, and the host smiled before saying, "You know, sometimes heroes don't wear capes, they wear jeans and carry compassion." Newspapers followed suit. The Los Angeles Times ran an opinion column titled, "Heroic Simplicity: The Power of Keanu Reeves' Quiet Defiance." It praised how his silence afterward had amplified the message rather than diluted it. In a world addicted to statements and selfies, the columnist wrote, Keanu Reeves gave the world something it wasn't ready for: authentic humility. On social media, debates raged, but not the kind fueled by anger. People began discussing what true respect looked like, how easily society judged worth by appearance. Videos emerged of restaurant owners around the country announcing no dress code days in solidarity. Others created donation drives for construction workers, janitors, and public servants, tagging them with number Dignity Matters and number True Brother. A sociology professor at UCLA even used the story in her ethics class. "This wasn't about wealth," she told her students. "It was about moral courage. What makes it powerful is not the outrage, but the restraint." Through all of it, Keanu stayed silent. Reporters tried endlessly to get a comment. Some approached him on film sets, others waited outside his charity motorcycle shop. But every time, his answer was the same: a polite smile, a brief nod, and silence. That silence became part of the legend. People started quoting it as a lesson in itself. One online post read, "He never said a word after the story blew up. That's why it meant something." Meanwhile, the four construction workers, Carlos, Eddie, Ramon, and Luis, became beloved figures in their community. Local kids recognized them from the clip and waved when they saw them on the job. Their foreman started jokingly calling them the famous four. But behind the humor was respect. Their co-workers began treating them differently, more kindly, more thoughtfully, and deep down, the men carried that night with them like a quiet light that wouldn't go out. Then, one afternoon, a local radio station invited them to speak live on air. At first, they hesitated, uncomfortable with the attention, but eventually, Carlos agreed. "If it helps people see each other better," he said, "then I'll talk." The radio studio was small but warm, filled with the comforting smell of coffee and the quiet buzz of microphones. The host, a friendly woman named Renee, greeted the four men as if they were longtime friends. "Welcome, gentlemen," she said with a grin. "You've become something of local legends," Carlos chuckled, adjusting his headset. "Legends? We just wanted dinner," he said, making the room laugh. Renee leaned in. "But it became so much more than dinner, didn't it?" Millions watched that video. People said it made them rethink how they treat others. How does it feel, knowing that? Carlos exchanged a glance with Eddie, then spoke softly. "It's humbling. We didn't expect anything like that. We're construction workers, not celebrities." But that night, it reminded us that what we do matters, that we're seen. Eddie added, "You know what's funny? We were embarrassed that night, felt like we didn't belong. But Keanu changed that. He didn't just stand up for us, he reminded everyone what respect looks like." Renee nodded, her tone gentler now. "Do you think things have changed since then?" Ramon smiled faintly. "Maybe not everywhere, but people notice us more now. The security guard at the hospital we're building says good morning every day. The The diner down the street never lets us pay for coffee. Small things, but they mean a lot. The host smiled warmly. Sometimes, change starts small. One kind word at a time. Luis leaned toward the mic, his voice steady. You know what I think about the most? It wasn't about fame or a celebrity moment. It was about one man who saw injustice and said no. He didn't need to yell or fight. He just stood there and made it stop. I'll never forget that. As the interview continued, the men shared how their families had reacted. Carlos spoke about his son, Mateo, who still told everyone at school. My dad sat with Keanu Reeves. Eddie mentioned how his mother in El Paso had cried watching the news, saying, Mijo, someone finally saw you. Before the segment ended, Renee asked one final question. If you could say one thing to Keanu Reeves right now, what would it be? There was a pause. Carlos took a deep breath. I'd tell him thank you for reminding the world that dignity doesn't wear designer clothes. It wears hard hats, uniforms, and tired smiles. He didn't just help us. He helped people see that kindness isn't weakness, it's strength. The studio fell silent for a moment before applause filled the room. The recording later went viral again, shared with captions like, Real men, real gratitude. That night, as the crew packed up their tools after another long shift, Carlos pulled out his phone and played the interview back. The sound of his own voice made him emotional. Eddie clapped him on the shoulder. You did good, man. Carlos smiled faintly. We all did, and so did he. Across the city, people continued to talk about the story in classrooms, churches, and online forums. It had become more than a headline, it was a symbol. A teacher wrote to a newspaper saying she used the story to teach empathy to her students. A restaurant owner in Seattle posted a new sign. No exceptions. And somewhere in Los Angeles, Keanu Reeves sat quietly in his living room reading the transcript of that radio interview. No cameras, no reporters, just him and the sound of truth spoken by ordinary men. He smiled, folded the paper neatly, and placed it on his corkboard beside dozens of letters and notes from strangers who had changed their ways. For him, it was never about fame. It was about seeing the best of humanity reflect back proof that one simple act could echo forever. The house was quiet that night. The city outside hummed with the faint sound of traffic and distant music. But inside, Keanu sat alone in his study. A single lamp glowed on his desk, casting a soft circle of light over a leather-bound notebook. He opened it slowly, the paper worn from years of entries, thoughts, reflections, and pieces of gratitude that he never shared publicly. He took a moment before writing, staring out the window toward the hills, where the city lights flickered like 1,000 untold stories. The event at La Galleria had long faded from public conversation, but it still lived inside him. He hadn't spoken about it since that night, yet every now and then, it resurfaced in quiet moments like this. He began to write. People mistake stillness for emptiness, he wrote carefully, but silence can hold strength. Sometimes the loudest truths are the ones you speak without raising your voice. He paused, his pen hovering over the page. The memory came back in fragments, the tension in the restaurant, the embarrassed faces of the workers, the sound of silverware freezing mid-air when he stood up. It wasn't the confrontation he remembered most. It was the look in their eyes afterward, gratitude mixed with disbelief, as if no one had ever stood beside them before. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. For years, he'd lived quietly, keeping to himself, content to stay away from drama and spotlight. Hollywood had mocked him once for being too ordinary, for refusing to play the part of a superstar. He remembered the headlines that called him awkward, the talk shows that laughed at his clothes, the way people mistook humility for weakness. He smiled faintly now, not in bitterness, but in peace. It's strange, he wrote, how people can see you every day and still not understand you. The world values noise, but I've learned that real character isn't in how loud you speak, it's in how deeply you listen. He flipped to a fresh page and continued writing, this time thinking of the 4 construction workers. Their faces had stayed with him, the exhaustion, the pride beneath the dirt and calluses, the humility that came from a life of hard work. They hadn't asked for help that night. They'd only wanted a meal. I wonder, he wrote, How many others get turned away every day, not from restaurants, but from opportunity, from dignity? How many quiet souls walk through the world unseen, simply because someone decided they weren't dressed for belonging? He rested his pen, staring at the words as they sank in. The thought unsettled him, not in anger, but in purpose. He closed the notebook for a moment, letting the question hang in the stillness. Then, slowly, he wrote again. Maybe the real work isn't in reacting to injustice when it happens in front of you. Maybe it's in preventing it quietly, wherever you can. Not through speeches or posts, but through action that leaves no trail, just change. Keanu set the pen down for a moment and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second echoing in the quiet. He thought about the lives that had brushed against his own because of that night, the waiter who'd chosen integrity over fear, the manager who had written to him weeks later, the workers who'd simply wanted dinner. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out over Los Angeles. From this height, the city looked peaceful, almost fragile. He knew better. Beneath the glow of those lights were millions of stories, some loud and glamorous, others quiet and forgotten. He'd been both. Once, the young actor mocked for being too still, too plain. The man people whispered about, the one who never quite fit the Hollywood mold. He smiled faintly, remembering the magazine covers that called him Hollywood's most mysterious man. They had no idea how simple it really was. He just didn't like noise. He didn't like time. Pretense. He liked people who said little but meant everything. Returning to his desk, he opened the journal again and began to write. I think about those men sometimes, the ones at the restaurant. They reminded me of my father, of the quiet pride that comes from working with your hands. Society applauds fame, but it overlooks labor. Yet it's labor that keeps the world standing. The hands that build, fix, clean, and carry, they're the true backbone of life. We just forget to look. He tapped the pen lightly against the page, then wrote another line beneath it. The most beautiful people I've met are never the loudest. They're the ones who show up. They do their work. They don't ask for applause. They only hope for fairness. He paused again, thinking about what fairness really meant. It wasn't equality of fame or wealth, it was equality of respect. Something so simple, yet so rare. His eyes drifted to the corkboard above his desk. Dozens of letters were pinned there, written by strangers, people he'd never met, but whose stories touched him deeply. Letters from cancer survivors, single parents, teachers, and now, Victor Hale, the former restaurant manager who had once humiliated those workers. Keanu had received Victor's letter 2 weeks ago. He hadn't told anyone about it. The words were sincere, humble, and filled with remorse. Victor had written about volunteering at a shelter, about rediscovering what compassion felt like, about learning to lead through service rather than control. At the end, he'd written, "You taught me more in 5 minutes than I learned in 20 years." Keanu had read it 3 times before folding it neatly and pinning it beside the others. He didn't reply, not because he didn't care, but because some lessons are best honored in silence. He wrote in his journal again, "Forgiveness begins when truth is faced. It's not about erasing what happened, it's about learning from it." Victor found his way back. That's enough. As the night deepened, he felt a calm resolve settle in his chest. The fame, the praise, the endless chatter online, it didn't matter. What mattered was the quiet impact, the invisible ripples that spread far beyond his reach. He closed his notebook, turned off the lamp, and whispered into the dark, "Do more, not louder, not for cameras, just more." In the stillness, those words felt like a promise to the world, to the men he'd defended, and to himself. Several months passed, and the world had mostly moved on to new stories. But for those touched by that night at La Galleria, the lesson remained alive in small, enduring ways. One afternoon, while Keanu was reviewing a film script in his modest home office, his assistant knocked gently on the door. "Someone's asking to meet with you," she said. "A filmmaker. Her name's Elena Moore. She says it's about a documentary." Keanu set the script aside and nodded for her to let the woman in. A few moments later, Elena entered, a woman in her 40s, wearing jeans, a plain gray sweater, and a look of quiet purpose. She held a worn leather folder under her arm. "Mr. Reeves," she began, "thank you for taking the time. I'll get straight to the point. I'm creating a short documentary called Table for Everyone. It's about dignity, equality, and the small human moments that reveal who we really are." Keanu listened silently, his expression calm and attentive. "I'd like to include the story from the restaurant," she continued, "the one that inspired so many people. Not for drama, not for publicity, but as a reminder that kindness can ripple further than we imagine. I'd be honored if you'd participate, even just a short interview about what that night meant to you." Keanu smiled faintly, shaking his head. "I appreciate that," he said softly. "But I'm not sure the world needs more of me talking about it." Elena tilted her head, slightly. "With respect, Mr. Reeves, sometimes silence keeps others from learning what they could. This film could reach people who've never seen that clip or understood what it meant." Keanu thought for a moment, then replied, "I agree with the message. But the story was never about me. It was about what we all carry inside us, the dignity we owe each other. If you want to tell that story, I'll support it. But quietly." Elena frowned slightly. "Quietly?" He nodded. "No interviews, no credits. I'll help fund the project. You tell it your way, and let it belong to everyone." Her eyes widened. "You do that anonymously?" Keanu gave a small, sincere smile. "Anonymity is freedom. The work will speak for itself." After a moment of stunned silence, Elena nodded, deeply moved. "Then I'll make it count," she said. "I promise." They shook hands, and she left the house with tears quietly welling in her eyes. Over the following months, Keanu's contribution, entirely uncredited, made the small documentary possible. Elena traveled across the country, interviewing workers, service staff, and everyday people who had once faced judgment or exclusion. She even met Carlos and his crew, who shared their story once again, this time not as victims, but as voices of dignity. As production neared completion, Keanu kept his distance, never calling or checking progress. But he followed updates through quiet channels, trusting that the film's purpose would find its way into the world. When the documentary Table for Everyone premiered 6 months later, it didn't open in theaters or red carpet events. It debuted in a small community center in Pasadena, projected on a portable screen before an audience of local teachers, families, and students. There were no celebrities, no flashing cameras, just people who cared about what the film stood for. The documentary opened with simple, quiet shots of hands. Hands tying work boots, hands serving food, hands washing dishes. A narrator spoke softly. "We all build something, whether with our hands or with our hearts." Then came interviews with construction crews, servers, janitors, and hotel staff people whose stories often went unheard. They spoke about the pride of doing honest work and the pain of being treated as invisible. One of the last segments featured Carlos and his friends sitting on folding chairs at a construction site, sharing their memory of that night. Carlos spoke first. He didn't make a speech. He didn't try to be a hero. He just saw something wrong and made it right. Eddie added, "He treated us like equals. You can't fake that." Ramon leaned forward, smiling softly. "It wasn't about fame. It was about respect. He showed us what that looks like." The camera lingered on their faces, lined, weathered, sincere, and the audience in the small room fell silent. Elena had crafted the film with tenderness, weaving real stories with a quiet soundtrack of piano and guitar. The final scene showed a group of workers and families sitting together at a long outdoor table. Plates of simple food were passed around, and the laughter that rose felt genuine, unfiltered, human. Across the bottom of the screen, the final quote appeared in white letters. "We all build something, whether with our hands or with our hearts. K." The audience clapped softly as the screen faded to black. A few people wiped their eyes. Others sat still, lost in reflection. Afterward, Elena stepped to the front of the room, her voice trembling slightly. "This film was funded by someone who didn't want to be named," she said. But I think we all know who that someone is, and I think we understand why he didn't want credit." The crowd nodded, murmuring in agreement. From that small beginning, Table for Everyone spread far beyond its modest premiere. Schools began requesting copies to show students. Churches and community centers screened it during outreach events. Even major universities began using it in ethics and sociology classes to spark discussions about human worth and equality. In every showing, that final quote lingered with people long after the credits ended. Meanwhile, Keanu never mentioned the film publicly. He watched it privately one evening at home, a digital copy sent to him by Elena. He sat alone, the glow of the screen reflecting in his eyes, as he saw Carlos and his friends laughing, Liam serving coffee, Victor helping at the shelter. The ripples of one small stand had grown into something vast, something beautiful. When the film ended, he sat in silence for a long while, his heart full but calm. He whispered to himself, "That's how change should look: quiet, real, shared." He placed the remote down and returned to his journal. On a blank page, he wrote one final reflection. "I've seen what one simple act can build. Not fame, not noise, but hope passed hand to hand, heart to heart." He closed the notebook and turned off the lights. Outside, the city hummed, alive with countless unseen acts of kindness, each one building its own quiet story. By the following year, the ripple from that one evening had spread further than anyone imagined. What began as a viral moment had grown into a quiet movement. Liam's Second Chance Cafe became more than just a neighborhood success. It became a model for compassion-led business. He had started with a single storefront in East Los Angeles, but soon letters began arriving from across the country. Some were from veterans who wanted to open similar cafes in their own towns. Others were from former inmates looking for a second chance. A group of college students in Oregon even wrote to Liam asking if they could volunteer to learn his approach to serving from the heart. Within 2 years, with donations, small grants, and the growing attention from Table for Everyone, Liam expanded into 3 locations. Each cafe had the same mission: to hire those who had been overlooked, to treat every customer like family, and to use kindness as currency. When asked by a local reporter what inspired him to expand, Liam smiled and said simply, "Because someone once believed doing the right thing mattered more than being seen doing it." Customers loved the cafes not just for the food, but for the atmosphere. Walls were lined with photos of employees smiling, beside handwritten signs that read, "Everyone deserves a seat at the table." Above every counter, framed in plain wood, was the quote that had inspired it all: "Keep serving from the heart. K.R." In the years that followed, Liam's story began appearing in business ethics textbooks and leadership seminars. Professors used it as a case study under a new term coined by one scholar, the Reeves principle. True leadership is moral courage expressed through humility. At universities, students analyzed the viral clip and discussed how one man's refusal to stay silent had redefined the idea of influence. One young philosophy professor summarized it best: "He didn't win by power, he won by example. That's a harder victory, but the one that lasts." Meanwhile, the once exclusive restaurant, La Galleria, had quietly rebranded under new ownership. The chandeliers still hung, the silver still sparkled, but the tone was different now. They started hosting a monthly event called Community Night, offering discounted meals for workers, teachers, and first responders. Some of the same patrons who had watched that uncomfortable scene years ago now came back not for status, but for reflection. A woman who had once laughed at the construction workers later wrote an open letter online saying, "I saw kindness that night and didn't understand it. Now I do. It changed me." The viral clip that had once been shared for its drama now circulated for its meaning. Teachers showed it in classrooms to discuss empathy. Corporate trainers used it to spark conversations about fairness and respect in the workplace. And everywhere it was shown, one message came through: justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands quietly and refuses to move. As Table for Everyone continued circulating, it began showing up in unexpected places. Corporations used it during employee workshops, encouraging managers to rethink how they treated staff. Police academies played it during ethics training, and churches used it in sermons about humility. Even military bases screened it as part of leadership programs, focusing on the moral courage of doing what's right without seeking praise. What made it timeless was its simplicity. There were no special effects, no grand speeches, just a moment where decency triumphed over pride. The clip's message transcended the event itself. In one online forum, someone wrote, "The world didn't just watch Keanu Reeves defend a group of men. We watched a man defend human worth." Years later, college students studying moral philosophy still debated that night. Some argued it was an act of social justice. Others said it was empathy in motion. But all agreed it was something rare proof that goodness could still shock people in a world accustomed to cynicism. Meanwhile, Liam's cafes continued to grow. One opened in Chicago, another in Austin, and a third in Portland. Each location carried the same spirit: simple food, honest service, and unconditional welcome. Veterans and ex-convicts worked side by side, their stories etched into the cafe's walls, reminding customers that redemption isn't earned, it's given. Reporters occasionally tried to link the movement back to Keanu, but he always declined interviews. "He's just not interested in attention," Liam told one journalist. But if you look close enough, you'll see his fingerprints everywhere. Keanu's quiet influence extended beyond the cafes. Foundations began funding job training programs modeled after Liam's. Restaurants introduced community inclusion initiatives. Even fashion brands launched workwear with dignity campaigns, donating proceeds to labor programs. None of these efforts carried Keanu's name, but everyone knew who had started the spark. One evening, as Liam closed his flagship cafe, a delivery arrived without a name, just a small wooden crate wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a hand-carved sign with elegant letters that read, "A table means nothing until it's shared." Liam smiled as he hung it above the entrance. The next morning, customers stopped to admire it, unaware that the man who'd sent it was sitting quietly in a nearby car, watching through the window before driving away. Elsewhere in Los Angeles, La Galleria's community nights continued to grow in popularity. Patrons who once valued exclusivity now welcomed construction crews, hospital janitors, and service workers as honored guests. A waiter who'd been hired recently said something that captured it best. "It's funny. We used to serve people to impress them. Now we serve people to connect with them." The story had come full circle. Through all of this, Keanu remained the same: humble, quiet, unchanged. He continued his work, riding his motorcycle through back roads, filming when he needed to, disappearing when the world got too loud. Reporters still called him a mystery, but those who understood knew it wasn't mystery, it was peace. When asked in a rare interview about why he avoided fame, he simply smiled and said, "Because life isn't about being seen, it's about seeing others." That quote joined the countless phrases inspired by his example. It appeared in classrooms, on posters, and even engraved into plaques in the second chance cafes. The viral video that once trended for 24 hours had become something lasting, a symbol of what it means to treat people with respect, no matter what they wear or where they come from. And somewhere in the quiet corners of his journal, Keanu wrote one more line: "We all build something, some with our hands, some with our words, some with our choices. But the strongest structures are made of kindness." Months later, under a clear California sky, the sound of drills and hammers filled the air at a downtown construction site. Dust floated in beams of sunlight, and the smell of wet concrete hung thick in the morning air. Carlos wiped his brow, steadying a steel beam as Eddie called out measurements from above. They were building a new hospital wing, the same one they'd been working on the night everything changed. A car pulled up quietly near the gate. The workers didn't notice at first. The man who stepped out wore jeans, a black t-shirt, and a baseball cap. He carried a cardboard tray stacked with steaming coffee cups and a paper bag filled with pastries. He crossed the gravel yard with a familiar, unhurried stride. "Break time?" Keanu said, smiling, as he set the tray down on a makeshift table. The crew froze for a second, then erupted in laughter and disbelief. "No way," Eddie shouted. "You're kidding me. He actually came back." Carlos dropped his gloves and walked over, shaking his head with a wide grin. "You didn't have to do this, man." Keanu shrugged, his smile easy and genuine. "Didn't have to. Wanted to." They gathered around the table, still in their dusty vests and work boots. Keanu handed out the coffees one by one, calling each man by name. Carlos black, no sugar. Eddie, double cream. Ramon decaf, right? Ramon blinked. "You actually remembered that?" Keanu chuckled. "I try." The men laughed, trading stories, their voices blending with the rhythmic hum of the city. Cameras weren't there, no reporters, no flashing lights, just a handful of workers and a man who'd never stopped treating them like equals. As they talked, Carlos mentioned that his son Mateo had gotten into college on a scholarship. Eddie shared that he'd started mentoring younger workers on safety and respect. Ramon said he'd finally taken his mother to dinner at a nice restaurant, and that this time, nobody looked at them twice. Keanu listened quietly, sipping his coffee. Then he said softly, "You know, that night, it wasn't about me doing something big. It was just about doing something right. That's all any of us can do." Carlos nodded, emotion flickering in his eyes. "You reminded us of that, brother." Keanu looked around at them, smiling as the morning sun reflected off the steel framework above. "No one's above anyone here," he said. "We all eat the same bread." The words hung in the air, simple and powerful. The men nodded in unison, and for a long moment, nothing else needed to be said. They just stood there together, laughing and talking like old friends sharing a quiet victory. A few of the younger workers nearby, who had only heard the story secondhand, stood watching with admiration. They didn't interrupt, they just smiled, realizing they were witnessing something rare. A man whose greatness came not from his fame, but from his humility. As Keanu prepared to leave, Carlos clasped his hand firmly. "You ever need a house built?" he said with a grin. "You know who to call." Keanu smiled. "I'll take you up on that." Before leaving, Keanu took one last look at the half-built structure rising against the bright sky. The sound of tools and laughter mixed together, carrying a rhythm that felt alive like the heartbeat of something bigger than concrete or steel. He smiled. "You guys are building more than a hospital," he said. "You're building hope." Carlos nodded, a grin tugging at the corners of his face. "Guess that makes you part of the crew now." Keanu laughed. "Then I'll take my paycheck in coffee and friendship." Eddie raised his cup and said, "To good people, no matter what they wear." Keanu raised his cup too, meeting their eyes. "To good people," he repeated softly. They drank together as the sun warmed the sight. For a moment, everything stood still. Just men, laughter, and honest work under open sky. No fame, no hierarchy, no pride, only respect. As Keanu headed back to his car, Ramon called after him. "Hey Keanu, you ever think about how far that one night went?" He paused, turning back with a thoughtful smile. "Not really," he said. "I just think about how far it can still go." The men watched him walk away, a simple figure disappearing into the city's motion. He didn't wave, didn't turn for a final look. He didn't need to. The connection was already there, unspoken, but lasting a thread woven through shared humanity. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, news quietly spread again, but this time, not through headlines or viral clips. A passerby had snapped a single photo of Keanu standing among the workers, holding a coffee cup, laughing like one of them. The image circulated on social media with no hashtags, no flashy captions. Just one sentence beneath it. "Class isn't about what you wear, it's about who you are." Within days, the image became symbolic, a gentle reminder of humility. Teachers printed it for classroom walls. Nonprofits used it in slideshows about empathy. Even business leaders referenced it in seminars about ethical leadership. But Keanu stayed silent once more. He didn't comment, didn't confirm or deny the visit. To him, the real reward wasn't attention. It was seeing lives move forward because of kindness, not controversy. Weeks later, Liam hung that photo in the Second Chance Cafe. next to the framed note that read, "Keep serving from the heart." Beneath it, he added a new plaque that said, "We all eat the same bread." Customers noticed and smiled every time they read it. Some didn't even know who the quote belonged to, they just knew it made them feel something. And somewhere on the other side of town, Keanu closed his journal and turned off the light in his study. He'd written only one line that night. True class isn't about clothes or money. It's about how you treat people when no one's watching. The next morning, construction on the hospital continued. Liam's Cafe welcomed another line of customers. And people everywhere kept passing the story forward, not through grand gestures, but through small, quiet acts of decency. The laughter under that construction site's sun became a lasting image of what humanity could be when compassion led the way. A reminder that every act, no matter how small, builds something that lasts. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up for what's right in public? Tell us below. And what story do you want to see next, featuring Keanu Reeves standing up for justice?